what we have in Genesis 1 is an understanding of the relationship between language or logos and reality. God speaks and things come into being. And God not only speaks them into being, but he pronounces them good. So there's a whole network of relationships between what is spoken by God, what is, and the value that's given to it. And what that diagonalizes, I think, is a dichotomy that you find in philosophy, but also I think in the way that people think, between an idea on the one hand that language, that reality is completely transparent to language. In other words, everything that language says about the world makes the world completely open. There's an idea from Spinoza that the extent of language is the extent of the world, so that you can map the world and language one to one onto each other. That's one side of the dichotomy. The other side is that language really bears no intrinsic relation to the world at all, and language creates reality. And this would be more the position that someone like Jacques Lacan, or to some extent with some nuances Derrida, would have, that language is imposing a structure on reality rather than reading a structure of reality. And again, I think what the Bible does is it says, well, if you only give me those two options, then I can't express the complexity and nuance that's in Genesis 1. So language, God's language, brings reality into being. So there's an intimate relationship between words and things there. It's not that first of all you've got a mute reality and then later on language comes along and struggles to try and describe it. Right from the beginning, there's an interwovenness of language and reality. But there's also a difference between God's language and our language. So when God speaks, things happen, and when we speak, they don't. And so I think it's helpful to draw that distinction, looking at this from a Christian point of view, and to say that our language will get things wrong. We will misunderstand. We will miscategorize reality. Reality is not transparent to our language, and yet it is completely comprehended and brought into being by God's language. And I think that gives you, again, a more nuanced and a more complex approach to the relationship between language and reality than either of the two options, that either language and reality map onto each other completely, or that language is just creating categories in reality rather than understanding what's already there. In all these, I guess one thing that I'm trying to say in the book is that in all these areas, the Christian position is actually, compared to the other options, really very nuanced, very complex, very rich, and very open to thinking further and to engaging with different positions.
Christopher, you have a very rich, a geometrically rich book, I might say. Not only speaking of diagonalization, but you speak of U-shaped and N-shaped thinking. What is that, and how do you use those ideas to help you carry out the task of cultural critique that you speak of?
Yeah, I introduced this distinction between U-shaped and N-shaped thinking to try and capture two ways of thinking about the relationship, either between human beings and God specifically, or between human beings and ultimate reality more generally. So there's a common way of conceiving that relationship in most religions and most spiritualities, where I offer something to God. I bring something to the table, sacrifice or whatever it is. And then God, or the gods, or whoever it is, responds to me, acknowledges that sacrifice, does something in return. And there's sort of an exchange relationship between me and God. I give him something, he gives something back. I do something for him, I make a sacrifice for him, I do good works for him, and then he rewards me in some way by giving me what I prayed for, or whatever it is. And that is not only a way of thinking about our relationship with God, but also it bleeds over, it overflows into a fundamental way of thinking about human relationships as well. It leads to an ideology of competition and merit and performance, that the strongest, the most accomplished, the cleverest people win because they've got more to offer, and so forth. So there's a whole view of society that comes out of this N-shaped dynamic. So the N-shaped idea comes from the shape of the letter N. If you imagine it, it starts in the bottom left, and then first of all it goes up, and then it comes down again. And so first of all, I offer something to God, offer something upwards, and then the response comes back down again. I perform, and I get the reward. That's the N-shaped dynamic. Now, of course, the Bible completely blows that out of the water. If you think about Acts 17 and Paul's Areopagus address, what on earth can you offer to God? He gave you life and breath and everything. He doesn't live in temples built by human hands. There's no possibility to relate to this God in whom we live and move and have our being in an N-shaped way. Anything that you want to give him, he's already given you. And so the Bible speaks about what I'm calling it a U-shaped dynamic, which means you start up at the top left in the shape of the letter U with God. God takes the initiative. God gives you life, breath, everything, but also God reaches down to you in grace. He makes the first move. You don't perform to get his attention. He reaches down, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us, before you brought anything to the table. And what we do in response is not perform for him, but live out of gratitude. So the upstroke of the U, the right-hand side stroke of the U, is not me then winning God's favor, but me joyfully responding to the grace that he's lavished on me when I didn't deserve it. And again, this is not just a way of relating to God. It's not just that grace is an idea cloistered up in theological walls. This spills over into a whole view of society. That you care for the poorest not because they're performing and they're worth caring for in an economic sense, but because that is mirroring the vision of a God who loves the ungodly. You care for those who are old, not because they're economically viable, not because
Right.
they're making a contribution, not because they're performing,
Hmm.
but because that's the sort of thing God does. And so this idea of the N-shaped and U-shaped dynamic, it's a view of how we relate to God, but it's also two very different views of society and what it means to live together in community.